Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. What's going on in Ukraine has been something that I've been focused on in my show, and I think that the whole world has been focused on for the last, what is it now, 7 months since Putin invaded on February 24th, Ukraine. And, today or this past weekend, I saw on the front page of the New York Times stories of some of the people that were accosted in Bucha and murdered in Bucha, and stories about that. I wanted to connect in with someone who I met numerous years ago at a big fundraiser for a Ukrainian camp that was for orphans that were orphaned because of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And she's been involved in Ukrainian charitable issues for a long period of time. Just last week, she wrote co-wrote an article on airspace and some military issues. So I thought it'd be interesting to check in with her about, what it's like for Ukrainian-Canadian, for someone who's so involved in a bunch of different charitable issues historically, and obviously currently a whole bunch of issues in regards to the war in Ukraine. What's going through her head? So I want to introduce you to Laryssa Waler. Her maiden name and her married name is Laryssa Hetmanchuk. She has been involved, as I mentioned, in Ukrainian activities for a long period of time, written about it, and now she wants to talk about it tonight. Laryssa, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So tell me a little bit about what it's like to be a Ukrainian Canadian. You obviously feel very connected to your I don't even know, is it your home country, your parents' home country? And how you deal with what's going on.
Yeah, it's difficult to watch, and you feel guilty. It's almost, you could almost equate it to a survivor's guilt. The only reason I'm not there fleeing or fighting is because my grandparents and my parents got papers to flee after World War II. Half our family got papers, half our family didn't. And that's probably true for most of the people who came in, in that post-World War II wave of immigrants, of which I'm a child of. And so we feel a real moral responsibility to help how we can, but also almost to bear witness. Like I read all the stories, I'm on all the Telegram channels, because I feel a duty to actually understand what's happening there. And you feel like it could have been you, if not for a stroke of luck or a stroke of a pen. That would have been me, my husband, my children. And so because it's not, I have to use the skill sets I have and the opportunities I have in Canada, like being on your show, to talk about it, to keep drawing attention to it, in hopes that we keep an international pressure on both governments to help Ukraine, but also, as much as possible, Russia to leave Ukraine.
Where are you or your parents from in Ukraine?
We're from the western half, so really close to the Polish border. My grandmother's from an area called Drohobych, and my grandfather's from an area called Volyn.
And one of the things that I think that has shocked people in the last little while, and I spoke to someone in Kyiv just last week who I guess was in, I don't know the exact pronunciation, Lviv? Lviv. For, I guess, 4 or 5 months, and just returned in August to Kyiv for the first time. And now she says she doesn't know where she's safe, or whether Kyiv or Lviv, because it's under attack as well.
Yeah, that happened on Monday. A lot of Canadians, a lot of people I know have been going to Ukraine as part of the war effort since Putin invaded or escalated his invasion. And the general rule of thumb is you're safe in Lviv, you're safe in Kyiv. Kyiv, you're safe because there's good there's adequate air defense systems in Kyiv, especially around the city center. So people always kind of assume they were safe there. Lviv, it's so close to Poland, it's so close to the border. Everyone sort of assumed you're safe there too. You're not as safe in the smaller towns because civilian targets are such a big part of Putin's war plan. But that's where you thought you were safe. And that's just not true anymore. And I was on some conference calls this week following Monday's missile attacks. And, people don't have electricity, they don't have adequate internet, they don't have power yet. And these are sort of the civilian targets that Putin's going after to rain like real terror on the Ukrainian people.
Do you have family still in that area?
Yeah. No, I have family in the West. A lot of the women and children went to Poland and to Romania and Germany, and the men stayed. They're mostly in Kyiv.
What are they telling you about what it's like?
I mean, it's not just family. It's friends. It's our peer groups. It's scary, right? You have Ukrainians armed forces, which are a couple 100,000 strong, and they're pretty well trained. They're being supplied with military gear and military equipment from the West. We can talk about how much they're being supplied. But a big part of the story are what we call the territorial defenders. These are the doctors, the lawyers, the bakers, the bus drivers, the musicians who've all taken up arms to protect their home. And you get a gun and you protect your territory. They needed to start, bulletproof vests and helmets and fuel and cell phones, night goggles. And now what they need are, tactical medical gear and training and winter jackets and boots, to a military grade. So supporting the territorial defenders has been a real focus of sort of the international diaspora response. The government will continue to, or governments will continue to provide military equipment, but there's almost two levels of fighters in Ukraine, right? There's actual soldiers, and then there's your normal everyday people, and they need help as well.
What have you been doing, and what have some of your peers been doing in Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, lots of stuff. There's sort of two ways to look at it. You can look at how you're supporting Ukrainians in Ukraine, and look at how you're supporting Ukrainians who've come to Canada as refugees or have gone around the world as refugees. I've been trying to do both. So my background is in communications and government relations. So I've sort of tried to use my skill set to help how I can. So I'll help organizations with media relations, with press releases, with social media campaigns, things like that, because that's what I can do best. I have friends who are, in logistics, and they help move aid around. My husband works for a big beer company, and they were looking at how can we help. Well, they have trucks, right? So when the trucks weren't on their beer runs, they were going around collecting aid and then palletizing the aid because you have to ship them on pallets. And how do you do that, right? So it's everyone kind of doing what they can to help. I would say, I could talk for an hour about aid going to Ukraine, and I could talk for an hour about supporting refugees here. I'd say where Canada's really fallen short is supporting the refugees here. They're not treating them as refugees. They're treating them as tourists with work visas for 3 years, which sounds great, like that they're getting a work visa, fine. But the people coming in are largely single women with young children, right? That's who's leaving. Everybody else is staying to fight. The men can't leave. They're not allowed to. So women are leaving with their kids. So they come here. They don't speak English. It's really expensive. They don't get any money. So you have to pay your own way here. And then once you get here, the federal government now, after some pressure, I think gives a $3,000 one-time payment. But then you're on your own. And then it's, the diaspora is trying to support you. We're not a diaspora that has been active in the international aid space, right? There's diasporas in Canada that are really good at receiving refugees. We just have never done it. And so it's a learning curve for the Ukrainian community. And, we're stepping up. But there's groups of refugees like the Afghans or the Yazidis. When they came to Canada, they were treated like refugees. The government gives you housing stipend. The government gives you like a bunch of social supports. Ukrainians aren't getting that. And it's falling to the provinces to sort of make a patchwork of aid. And so, you have tens of thousands of refugees coming into even the GTA. The kids have to go to school. They need OHIP cards. They need language training. And the province, which is not set up to do this, is scrambling to do it, because if you've got thousands of kids who need to go to school, they got to go to school. In real life, or in normal refugee supports, the federal government should have a plan for that and should have funding for that, and they just have refused to do that.
Any idea how big the issue is? How many refugees from Ukraine are in Canada? Any idea?
There's a government tracker. I think we're somewhere in 200,000-300,000. They've given
300,000. Seriously, that's the size of a city.
I think so. Double check that though. There's literally a government tracker that you can look up that has it. So I'm on a camera saying this, but check out the government tracker.
Okay. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 more minutes with Laryssa Waler to talk more about what's going on in Ukraine, what Ukrainian-Canadians are doing, what she thinks about Putin, what she thinks about the war, what she thinks about the West, what she thinks about NATO, and this article that she wrote about assistance for air defense and safe airspace. Stay with us, everyone. This is going to be an interesting conversation today. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is Ukraine and what's going on, and particularly how it impacts Canadians of Ukrainian descent and what people in Canada are doing. And I want to introduce you again to Laryssa Waler. She's a strategist from Toronto. She's very active in the Ukrainian community. Laryssa, we, I think, first met at a big gala fundraising event for orphans from Chernobyl. What's happened to those orphans during this war? Any idea?
Yeah, so actually, orphans during wartime is a whole, there's a whole discussion around it. My understanding is that Ukraine paused international adoption during war because there's so many moving parts. But the big story, and I actually tweeted about this the other day, are Russia is kidnapping Ukrainian children and taking them to Russia. And they brag about it. So they claim they've taken hundreds of thousands of children into Russian families. I saw a video and a story yesterday posted of this mother in Mariupol. Her children were taken to a summer camp. And the local authorities there, told all the parents that's going to be so great for the kids. We'll take them to a safe camp where they can get away from the war. And so all the parents are, okay, we'll do it, right? And you don't really have a choice anyway. But it's sort of a positive thing. The kids never came back.
They were told they were going to a summer camp and they never came back.
They never came back. So, I encourage everybody to look this up. Russia is, bragging about taking all these children and relocating them with Russian families. They're taking babies, they're taking toddlers. If you take a 10-year-old, the 10-year-old might remember that they're supposed to, go back home. When you take a baby or a toddler, a few years from now, you're never going to reunite that family.
That's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable.
You were telling us before the break that there were, 300,000, but it was applications for visas to come to Canada?
No, it's approved visas. So there's 600,000 applications. They've approved 300,000. So 300,000 of these tourist visas have been issued, and about 100,000 people have come to Canada so far. And
most of them in Southern Ontario, probably?
Yeah, it feels that way. They're going to communities where there are Ukrainian diasporas or where they know people. The problem is, when you come to Toronto, all the Ukrainian people are in Toronto, Mississauga, Oakville. It's really expensive to live here, right? So you come here, and even if you get a job that pays $20 an hour, $25 an hour, you've got 2 kids, you've got to pay rent, you've got to go to work. How do you do that?
Yeah.
And that's a bigger question of affordability and all that stuff.
Particularly when you don't speak the language and you've got
you don't speak the language.
You've got kids.
So a lot of families I'd say families through church communities, not just Ukrainian communities, but church communities have been opening up their homes. A lot of families, especially recent immigrants from Ukraine, my neighbor has 8 people living with her. They're on the couches, they're in the extra bedrooms, and they're just opening up their homes, but there's no off ramp right there. So it's you offer to take a family in, which is awesome. But until they're able to get out and stand up on their own, they're with you. And that's a huge burden for everybody. And this is, again, where the government isn't treating them like refugees. They're treating them like tourists with a work visa.
Why is that, do you think?
I don't know. The Ukrainian-Canadian Congress has put a lot of pressure on the federal government. I think, honestly, so it's almost like they got away with it because the province has stepped up to provide healthcare funding, housing funding, and education funding sort of for the first wave. And so because the refugees are getting, their kids can go to school, there's funding there. The government's sort of it's taken care of, but it's really not, right? More refugees are coming. So the need's going to increase, but also that first round of funding is just the first round of funding, right? are the provinces going to be on the hook? Ontario's commitment was $300 million to support something like 40,000 refugees. That's what they budgeted for. That's a lot of money, right? And that's for, I think, a year of stuff. So the federal government's got to really step up and put in a system across the country, and also figure out how to locate Ukrainians in communities that are able to sustain them. So where it's more affordable to live, where there's adequate childcare, where there's language services, and where there's jobs. And if you don't actually organize that, you get this sort of helter-skelter system of really unorganized, unsustainable settlements.
Yeah, yeah. Now, while 100,000 is a lot, I understand there's like tens of millions of Ukrainian refugees in Poland.
Yeah, Polish families. And, you know, Poland has been incredible, an incredible neighbor. Every family has a family is basically what they're saying, right? But that's a huge strain on the system. These people want to go back. They all had, not all, but the majority of them are, you know, middle class, upper middle class, you know, professionals, tradespeople, people who had a nice quality of life. You know, I think a lot of people thought Ukraine was sort of this backwards rural country, but the reality is most people had professions or trades. Their kids had good lives. And so, you know, you have refugees coming to Canada, they want to get their kids back in piano, back in soccer. You know, my kid needs math tutoring. My kid has a learning disability. Like, these are all sorts of things that parents and families in Ukraine had in Ukraine. And then, you know, suddenly they're refugees, and they're trying to both stay alive, but also keep a sense of normalcy for their own children. And I think the strain on the Polish system and the Polish communities is massive. But everyone, like a lot of the families in Poland, are kind of just parked there waiting to come home.
You know, I think it might be helpful for our listeners to take a step back, if we could, and just tell people a little bit about Ukraine. I've spent a reasonable amount of time in Ukraine. As you may remember, someone that we both know hired me to go and look at pharmaceutical plants and acquisitions in Ukraine. I spent about 6 months there over the course of 2 years, and primarily in Kyiv, but also in the West, and in a place called Poltava, and in a place that had 26 letters in the name. I can't even, you know, begin to potentially pronounce it. I think it started with Dnipro or something like that. But what, Ukraine is what, twice the size of Canada, 60 million people. Is that correct?
It was declining. I always thought it was around like 55, 60 million. And that number sort of goes down. But it's bigger than Canada. It's geographically the biggest country in Europe. It's bigger than France, it's bigger than Germany. It's on, you know, it's on the border of Europe with Russia. And it was always sort of like the buffer, right? And you can go back to, you know, I think in like 875, the history of, we call the Kievan Rus. It's almost like the empire that was between Kyiv and Russia. The history, like the start of it was where Kyiv is. So, you know, Russia always says, you know, Ukraine's been part of Russia. The reality is Russia was part of Ukraine when it all started. And then there's hundreds and hundreds of years of moving borders, and you know, the Ottoman Empire coming up, the Austro-Hungarian Empire coming in, the Russian Empire coming in, and Ukraine is kind of in the middle. And I remember when I was in Ukrainian school growing up in St. Catharines, Ontario, my Ukrainian history teacher would describe it as a hockey game on a hockey rink, and Ukraine was a hockey rink, but there were 5 teams, and you never knew who you're fighting. And that's kind of a good way to explain Ukraine. But Ukraine always was there. There was always a Ukrainian people. And then in 91, when the USSR broke down, you know, we had our borders. They were internationally recognized. Canada was the first country to recognize Ukraine. You know, that's a big, you know, fun fact that Brian Mulroney is kind of known as this like awesome guy in Ukraine, because they know that like Canada is Ukraine's friend.
There's I think something like more Ukrainian diaspora in Canada than anywhere else in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're except for Russia. We're the second biggest diaspora of Ukrainians around the world. Russia's the first, and Canada's the second. The relationship between Russia and Ukraine's always been, you know, an interesting one. There's times of peace, long times of peace, times of tension. It started getting more tense. If you remember back, and I think it was like 2002, 2004 with the Orange Revolution, where the president or the candidate at the time, Yushchenko, was poisoned. I remember his face got all weird from the poison. So there was always sort of a pro-Russian Ukrainian presidential candidate, and there was always a pro-Ukrainian one. And sometimes the pro-Russian one won, sometimes the pro-Ukrainian one won. And that's sort of like for the last 20 years, there's been that tension. In 2014 was the Revolution of Dignity. So you had, those big protests in Maidan Nezalezhnosti in the center of Kyiv. That was like on the news a bunch. So during that time, in that 2014 sort of era, Russia invaded, right? They took Donetsk and they took Luhansk. And those are and Crimea, we call it Krim, but Crimea. And Donetsk, Luhansk were sort of separatist territories, but even within them, it wasn't. There were no clear boundaries. And then Crimea was annexed, and there were, you can debate why the international community allowed that to happen, but that's where we're at. So when we say that Putin invaded in February, what Putin actually did was escalate his invasion, and it's interesting because we called it every 100, 200 years, Russia tries to invade Ukraine. So if you go back in our history, this isn't new. All of our patriotic songs that we sang as Boy and Girl Scouts, our national anthem in Ukraine, all speaks of fighting Russia. Like that is always the narrative that we have, right? In the lyrics of the Ukrainian national anthem, there's a part that says, our enemies will die like the dew in the morning sun. The enemy is Russia. It always has been. And yet
you were at one point in time in the same country, the USSR.
Well, yeah, right. But culturally, we always felt like a Ukrainian people.
My ex-father-in-law was Ukrainian, and he hated Russians, and he would come back over and over and over again to the Volodymyr. Tell us about that, if you could.
About the what?
Starvation, Stalin's starvation.
The Holodomor. Yeah.
Sorry, I pronounced it wrong.
No, that's okay. The Holodomor is something that more and more people are learning about. In 1932 to 33, Stalin had this program of collectivization of farms. So sounded not so bad on paper. What it really meant was they stole the grain and the food from Ukraine. It's hard to track how many people actually died. It's somewhere between 3 to 8 million of Ukrainians were starved to death between 32 to 33. It was widely, I don't even think they even acknowledged that it happened in Russia. Canada's called it a genocide. We have, Canada's done a really good job of funding Holodomor education, of supporting kind of our community and keeping this story alive. But again, it was, Russians are killing Ukrainians. And so, we're back here again, where they're using food as a weapon of war again. Ukraine, they call it the breadbasket of Europe. The soil is really good in Ukraine. So you've got like UN food programs get something like 33% of their grain from Ukraine for Africa. And what Russia did was block the ports, or they burn the fields, right? They bomb the warehouses. So you couldn't get that grain out of Ukraine to get it down to Africa and to other developing countries. And then they do a good job of the information war, saying like Ukraine's not giving you the grain, right? It's Ukraine that's starving you, but it's not. It's Russia.
The geography of Ukraine, stuck between Europe and Russia. And you mentioned that it was the breadbasket. Hitler wanted Ukraine for breadbasket reasons. Stalin did. Looks like Putin does now. The West is primarily rural, I think. The East is very industrialized. The West is Ukrainian speaking. Historically, the East has been Russian speaking. Is it two different solitudes within the country, or is it one country?
You know what? I would say that there probably was. We always sort of said the same thing. People in the East speak Russian. People in the West speak Ukrainian. I'd say in the last generation of people, like the millennials, Gen Zs, whatever, language has been a much less of a barrier in the Ukrainian identity. People acknowledge that Ukrainians speak Russian. Our own president, Zelensky, didn't speak Ukrainian until he became president. He had to learn it, sort of like our prime ministers have to learn French. He was Russian speaking, but he felt Ukrainian, right? I'd say the one thing that Putin has done a great job of is uniting Ukrainians. Russian-speaking Ukrainians and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians have really rallied under the Ukrainian flag, and so his attempt to break up that spirit, it's done the exact opposite. It's really unified an entire Ukrainian feeling across the country. But even if you look at, when the USSR broke up, if you look at how people voted, if they voted that they wanted to leave, every region of Ukraine, including the most pro-Russian regions, voted to leave the USSR. Like, they all wanted to leave. And so now you see these referendums, they're sham referendums. People who do vote are voting literally at gunpoint. So you can't take any of this referendum stuff that's coming out of Russia right now with any ounce of truth. It's just fake.
Does religion play a role here? When I was in Kyiv, I got the impression that Ukrainians went to the Ukrainian Catholic Church and Russian-speaking Ukrainians went to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. What's the role of religion, if any? No,
I mean, that's interesting because I grew up Ukrainian Orthodox. I would say Ukrainian Catholicism is more prevalent probably in the West. Ukrainian Orthodox is more prevalent in the East. The Ukrainian church it's a complicated beast, but there is an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is independent of the Russian Orthodox Church. And this was a big thing when the USSR broke apart. What does the church do? So there is a distinct Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, he's an actual KGB agent. And I sound like a conspiracy theorist when I say that, but look it up. He's an honest to God KGB agent. He has this whole narrative that this is a holy war against Nazis, against gay people, against, he keeps doing this narrative about, we're fighting the LGBT community. It's this whole thing, right? We're fighting Nazis. It's God's war, and he blesses the soldiers. But he is a puppet for Putin. I would say also there's a big piece right now that's going to come out, or that's sort of percolating. And it's hard, even for me, I did work for Pope Francis when he came to Canada. I did his media relations. But he hasn't been great on Ukraine. He talks a lot about wanting peace, right? And he talks a lot about speaking to Putin and calling for peace, and Ukrainians need to want peace too. If Russia stops, everyone says this, if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. And so, for the Pope or for other world leaders, for Elon Musk, whoever, to call for Ukrainians to want peace, it's such a garbage statement. It's not supporting Ukraine. And I know that Ukrainian Catholics are feeling quite isolated from the Pope specifically, over this whole narrative that they should just all work towards peace. So that's great, except that it's our children, it's our seniors who are being tortured and raped and dumped into mass graves. And if we stop fighting, it's not like that's going to stop.
Fascinating conversation with Laryssa Waler. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes and talk a little bit about airspace, the war, munitions, NATO, etc. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Laryssa Waler. She is a Ukrainian-Canadian, very active within Ukrainian-Canadian charitable circles, doing a lot of work with refugees, a lot of work in communications in regards to what's going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. Laryssa, I got to ask you, the front page of the Sunday New York Times is about three ladies in Bucha and their stories. And I think one of the things is, when you hear statistics of hundreds or thousands or whatever of people, you sort of don't focus on the real life human impact. And then, the story really chronicles the lives of these three ladies and what happened to them. What's it like for someone like you or others in the Ukrainian-Canadian community in Canada when you hear some of these horrific stories of rape, of torture, of murder? do you believe them? Are they believable? It seems like it's from an era that's 100 years old, or from a horror movie or something like that, not something that could actually be happening in today's world.
Yeah, I mean, you believe it because you see the video and the video evidence, right? The photo evidence. People used to say that the Holocaust would have never happened if we had social media. I don't believe that anymore. I used to think, of course, if people knew how bad it was, that would have never happened. I don't believe that anymore. And I'll say
Why
that
don't you believe that anymore?
because we know that bad things happen. We know that they're raping 4-year-old girls. We know that they're cutting the genitals off of the soldiers but keeping them alive. We know that they're shooting families in the knees, in the shoulders, in the elbows, and tying them up and leaving them there. But they're not even bothering to kill them. They're just shooting their joints so that they can't run away. We know that because we see the videos of it, and we know these people. These aren't like the people in Bucha or the people in Kyiv or the people in Mykolaiv. These aren't people we don't know. So these are people who have contacts around the world, right? And we used to look at the photos when they'd show photos of bodies, right? You'd look to see who that is. They would identify, there was one woman, I think in Bucha, they identified her because of her manicure, right? Because somebody saw a picture of her dead body and they recognized she had a very distinct manicure or a very distinct bracelet or a very distinct keychain. So that these things are happening, who they're happening to. To us, these aren't anonymous numbers. And you find these mass graves, the first thing they do is try to identify these people and then bury them. And so it's funny because in the photos that come out of Ukraine, you see photos of mass graves, and then very quickly you see photos of just a lot of graves. And they spend a lot of time and a lot of effort to take the bodies out of mass graves, identify them, and then bury them individually.
It's just horrific. Some of these stories, it's just unbelievable. In Canada, 1 in 4 Canadians has supposedly a blood relative in the United States. I understand the statistic is very comparable, that something like 1 in 4 Ukrainians has a blood relative in Russia.
I think it might be higher, actually.
And you've talked already about how the second largest, the largest population of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine is in Russia. Why is this happening? Why did Putin invade? Why are Russians supporting it? If there's such a close tie between Russia and Ukraine, and there's so many families that are on both sides of the border, why is this happening?
Yeah, I used to feel sympathy for the Russian people, that they're so duped by their own leaders that the soldiers don't really want to be there. But then as the war progressed, the soldiers are the ones who are doing the rape and the torture. And this doesn't end until the Russian people decide it ends. And they are just, we hear so many stories of Ukrainian families who've stopped talking to their Russian relatives because their own relatives are saying, well, no, your country's full of Nazis. And they'll say, I'm not a Nazi, right? I had a gun pointed at my face. I'm not a Nazi. Ukraine's run by a Jewish president. Ukraine is actually the only country in the world that has had a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister outside of Israel. It's a country where there are LGBTQ rights. It's a country where it's for a country that was so long ago, so recently part of the USSR. It's a country that is quite progressive in its views. It's come a really long way in a short period of time. It is 100% not perfect. There are bad people in every country, but the leadership of the country has been, very Western facing. Why Putin's doing it is not the same reason of why Russians believe it. Putin's doing it because he has this obsession with restoring the glory of Mother Russia. He has this complex that it is his life's mission to restore the glory of Mother Russia. Not necessarily the USSR. It's very much the Russian identity. And then the Russians are really good at the information war. Their own citizens they're afraid of speaking up. If they have an opposing view, they're afraid to voice it because they'll get thrown in jail. But you look at, like, they announced mobilization, and hundreds of thousands of people fled Russia, into neighboring countries because, they're pro-war until it's their sons or their fathers or their husbands have to go fight. And suddenly they're not so pro-war, but they still blame Ukraine for it. Which is, I cannot wrap my head around how this logic works. But until the Russian people decide to get rid of Putin or delegitimize Putin, that's not going to end.
There's supposedly over 100,000 young Russian men that have left Russia to Kazakhstan, etc. I don't know if you've got a better figure on that.
I think it's higher, but I don't know.
How do you think the international community should be dealing with these individuals? I think some countries think you shouldn't be welcoming them because, as you say, the only reason why they're leaving is because it was them called to fight. But before that, they were supporting the war. Others say, no, we should accept them because otherwise they're going to be conscripted and they're going to go to the front lines.
Yeah, I used to feel sympathy for them. I used to feel sympathy for Russians, but this doesn't end until the Russians want it to end. And the Russians have to feel pain for that to happen. I never felt such hatred towards anybody, any people. But I used to, when the war first started, when there'd be stories of like, well, they bombed a Russian ammunition plant, or they took down Russian planes, especially with the planes. I'd be like, oh, I feel bad for the dead Russian soldiers. I don't anymore, because, one dead Russian soldier probably means 20, 40, whatever Ukrainians get to live, because they're there to kill us, right? So it doesn't end until the Russian people want it to end, and they won't want it to end until they feel pain. And so, yeah, that means closing the borders. It means cutting them off. It means, taking away their reliance on Western systems. They talk about hating America so much, but they certainly like wearing Nike, and they certainly like listening to their iPhones, and they certainly like, watching American movies. But they've bought into this anti-American garbage from Putin.
You co-authored a really interesting article just a week or two ago about that Canada and NATO should be doing a far more to secure the airspace above Ukraine. Tell me about what your argument is there, if you could.
Yeah, so from the beginning of the war, we had this whole close the sky messaging track, and it's more than a messaging track. It's a military policy that the West has decided not to do. It's the idea of like protecting the skies above Ukraine, right? Like we can fight in the streets, we can fight in the trenches, we can fight using ground warfare, but Russia will send in missiles from Russia, they'll send in missiles from Belarus, and we can't get all those missiles. And they're indiscriminate or they're deliberate, they target civilians. The West has the ability to give Ukraine enough weapons to protect our skies. Or protect their skies, and the West has decided not to do that. And they can. There's precedent, and it's not consistent precedent, but there's precedent throughout the Middle East where you give them the tools they need to protect their skies. Part of what Matt Bondi, who I wrote the article with, part of the point that we made was that it needs to be a sovereign air defense system. So it's not that we want NATO soldiers or NATO planes to shoot down the Russian planes or the Russian missiles, but we want the West to give the Ukrainian army the tools to do it, because the Ukrainian army has shown so much that if you arm them, like not even enough, but if you arm them a little bit, they will outperform the Russians, at every measure. And that's what they've been doing. And they're clever. They're a clever people. What Canada and the West did well over the last 8 years was this thing called Operation Unifier. They trained Ukrainian soldiers. Ukrainian soldiers are well trained. Canada's good at training them. What Canada has been bad at is giving them the actual weapons to use the training that they gave them. right? So the Ukrainian soldiers know what they need to do. They just don't have the ammunition to do it.
You think that Russia really does want to kill Ukrainian civilians, and in your article you call it a war crime? Do you believe that?
Yes. Yes, I do.
You think they actually want to kill civilians? They
Yes, I do.
actually
Yeah.
have an intention of not accidentally killing civilians because they're going for military establishments. They actually have an intention of terrorism, and of killing civilians.
Yes, I do. That's what they've. It's not that what I believe. It's what they have shown. It is. They target playgrounds. They put mines in children's toys, right? Because they want kids to pick it up. Their goal is terror, right? And they inflict this terror by killing civilians. They targeted a pedestrian bridge in Kyiv that's full of tourists, right? You can't drive a car on there. There's no military strategic value to this bridge. It's a glass bridge that goes through a promenade. Like, it's why would you bomb that? Why do you need to rape a 4-year-old? Why do you need to tie up a 6-year-old and shoot her in the back? Why do you need to shoot a kid on a bicycle or bomb a family escaping, right? The point is terror. So it's a war crime. They'll quibble about whether it's a genocide, but it's certainly a war crime. The UN has called it a war crime. And so we've got Putin, who is, the president of a country in the UN, openly committing war crimes against another member of the UN. And, we're still pretending like you can negotiate with this guy. You cannot.
A lot of this, you can't call it justification, but the excuse for what's happened this past week has been because of the bombing of this bridge between Russia and Crimea. Was the bombing by Ukraine, if it was by Ukraine, of the bridge terror, or was it a military asset that deserved to be bombed?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know if it was Ukraine that bombed the bridge. I hope so, because it's a military asset. It's how they transport their goods, right? And they said it isn't, except once the bridge was bombed, they had a backlog in their ports of all this military equipment because they were using that bridge. The bridge was also highly symbolic, right? It was, I think, like 19 kilometers long. It was this big modern display of Russian might. We stole Crimea. We built this bridge. Look how modern it is. It's indestructible. It's a link between, Russia and Crimea. So its bombing was symbolically incredibly important to the Ukrainian people, but also it was a military portal. It's how they transported arms. And you can see that, again, because of the backup that resulted once the bridge was taken out.
We're chatting tonight with Laryssa Waler. She is a Ukrainian-Canadian. She's very involved in what the diaspora in Canada are doing to support Ukraine, both from a refugee standpoint as well as from a supporting what's going on in Ukraine and lobbying for military aid and not open skies, closed skies above Ukraine, etc. We're going to take a final break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask Laryssa, what do you think is going to happen? And can anything save and solve and end this situation without Putin being deposed? What's the end game here? Stay with us, everybody. Fascinating chatting with Laryssa Waler. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've been chatting tonight with Laryssa Waler. She is a Ukrainian-Canadian. She's been very involved. I think, Laryssa, gosh, it may have been like 8 or 10 years ago that we first met when you were involved in charitable works to support orphans in Ukraine, orphaned by the Chernobyl nuclear accident. And I think you've been involved in Ukrainian-Canadian issues before that and ever since, and lots of other communications issues. And I thank you for that involvement. And today's conversation has been interesting, and it's helpful, I think, for me and for everybody to hear, what it's like for you, knowing your friends, your family, your countrymen are being killed or being raped or are being terrorized, etc. So thank you for being open and sharing with us. What do you think is going to happen? How does this thing all end?
I think it ends when the Russian people want it to end, or Putin dies, or Putin's own generals take him out. I think, right now it's very much the US is supplying the majority of the weapons and the money to Ukraine. Biden has said he'll continue that. But I think it continues until this only ends with Putin dead or exiled. I don't know how Putin remains president of Russia, or how Russia remains in the world order with Putin as its president, with the war going on. I think we might get to a stalemate. We might push the Russians out all the way back to Donetsk and Luhansk, and we might be kind of back to a January 2022 situation. I don't know. But we've said, and Zelensky has said, that we're not going to give up our territory. We're not going to cede to Russia. You can't give it up, because once you do, you've set the precedent that he can do what he wants.
Do you think there's any chance that the Russian generals will take out Putin?
I'd love that. I would love that. I think, again, the pressure has to come from the Russian people. Until the pressure comes from the Russian people, or you have reasonable minds in the Russian leadership that sort of decide enough's enough. We haven't seen any indication of that. We've seen, Putin sitting at these really long tables with his generals at one end and him at the other. So there's no trust there. But Putin's a highly paranoid, and he's brilliant. He's a madman, but he's not a stupid man. He's going to keep power. He knows what he's doing. He's very intentional. I once went to this talk Stephen Harper gave a couple of years ago, long after he was prime minister, talking about how Putin thinks. And he is not a stupid man. And so he's going to probably outsmart and outwit his generals for a long time, until the Russian people rise up. But that's going to put Russian lives at risk, and it's going to put their own families at risk. And I don't see how that happens.
In the last couple of weeks, I think ever since this war started, but particularly in the last couple of weeks, Putin and the Russians have been making noises about making use of their nuclear arsenal.
Yeah.
If they do, what do you think the United States, NATO should do? Should they respond and
I wish I was an expert on this. I think about this honestly as a mom, right? I worry about nuclear war because I have children, and because I care about what the world looks like. But I don't know how you can negotiate with nuclear threats, because once you give in, you've given in. And then he can do that all the time, right? If you give him what he wants because he's going to drop a nuke on you, he gets what he wants every single time. And so does the Middle East. So do the guys out there with their dukes. And you see this alliance building between Russia and Iran right now, where Iran's stocking Russia with their missiles and other arms. And do we want to live in a world where they threaten us with nuclear war and nuclear disaster, and they get what they want? There are much smarter people than me that have to answer that question. But I think about it as honest to God, a mom who doesn't want to live in a world where, nuclear war and the threat of nuclear war is around every corner. And we also forget that we share a border with Russia up in the Arctic. It's not like this isn't a Canadian problem. We share a massive border up north. And so we got to be really thinking about how do we engage, and how do the next 5-10 years look like?
You said that you don't think Putin is a stupid man. I've been astounded by anyone thinking that you can rape, pillage, kill, murder, destroy the infrastructure, destroy the homes of, the farms of a country, and then hope that those country people will end up becoming your countrymen. How does Putin ever dream that Ukrainians, after this onslaught, after this war, after this carnage, would actually ever, if he was victorious, agree to become loyal citizens of this new, wider Russia?
That's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to kill the Ukrainians so that they're not his problem. He's bombing our towns. He wants the territory, but he's bombing all the stuff, right? He's bombing the infrastructure. He's bombing the schools. He's bombing the museum. He's killing the people. He wants the territory. He wants to say he did it. But he doesn't want the Ukrainian people to be in Russia. He wants the Russian people to be able to come and live on Ukrainian territory. So he's not trying to win over our hearts and minds. He's trying to win over Russian hearts and minds by by painting Ukrainians as this like Nazi monster, which is just not true. But he's not trying to win like my family who is in Ukraine over to become a loyal citizen of Russia.
So it is a genocide.
Well, like I think it's a genocide. If you look at what a genocide is, I would say that this is a genocide. He's trying to exterminate the people. He's burning our books. He's bombing our churches. He's taking our children. He's outlawed the Ukrainian language, right? Like there's when you look at genocide, there's the murder part, and then there's the cultural part where he's trying to exterminate the people.
Is Canada doing enough?
Oh, no. No, Canada's not doing enough. There's so much more Canada could do in terms of honestly supporting refugees, treating them as refugees, but also, I'm not pretending that Canada is a big military might or that we have unlimited resources, but the stuff that we do have, we're not doing well. So we produce LAV-3 vehicles, right? Which are like, Ukrainian soldiers need these vehicles. General Hillier talks about this all the time. And I'll give you like a quick anecdote. My brother-in-law has a ton of friends in Ukraine who are his age, and he's always running some sort of crowd fundraiser to buy more Jeeps and more trucks for the soldiers to get around. They're not traveling in armored vehicles. They're not traveling in armored personnel carriers. So when this RAV4 that they've bought somewhere used in Europe drives over a mine or is confronted with shrapnel of some sort, they die, right? If they were in a LAV-3 or if they were in a tank, they live. So we need armored personnel vehicles. We need, again, to close the skies. Canada's good at training. We can train them. We can give them support for, this is another article I wrote with Omar Yarkhan, support for investigating war crimes. And, the PMO was like, we announced that in March that we're going to do that, but you haven't done it, right? Like, yeah, you announced it, you just didn't do it. So it's supporting the prosecution of war crimes. There's stuff Canada can do. Again, I'd say the LAV-3s and the howitzers are the biggest thing they could actually do. They just announced more winter clothing, which is great, but it's October already. They could have announced that in the summer. They announced another $15 million of something. Like, $15 million is a lot of money, but it's actually not on the scale of what Ukraine is doing, right? And what Ukraine has on its plate. And if Ukraine folds, then it's NATO's problem. NATO needs Ukraine to succeed so that they don't have to engage in a wider warfare.
Laryssa Waler, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us your thoughts on the Ukrainian-Russian war. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for keeping the attention on this. I know that there's war fatigue and Ukraine fatigue, but the war's not over. So thank you.
Thank you. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.